So we're going to do three things today. We're going to look at the typology of those problems that you've just talked about, a way of categorizing the problems. We can associate those with particular decision styles. The second part we're going to do is look at some elegant solutions to some of these problems. And then the third bit, we're going to look at clumsy solutions to some of these problems. I'll explain what all these words mean as we're going along. Let me start with this. This is a graph from one of Richard Pascal's books, and it looks at change programs across time. This is from 1950 to 1995. What happens here, let me just read a few of these out if you can't read them from where you're sitting. So we have management by objectives, restructuring, management by walking about, corporate culture, empowerment, core competences, and so on and so forth. So if you go into 2013, you're up in the ceiling somewhere. And the consequence of this is that between 1950 and 1960, change was really difficult because we only had 3 ways to help you change. And now change is really, really easy because we've got all this stuff for you to read and to execute. That's all you have to do is read it, execute it. Thank you, good morning, and good luck with your reading. That was a joke. You can laugh when I do the jokes. Several things fall out of this enormous number of change programs. This is the first thing to think about. There's a niche market for books called something like this, the first 90 days or the first 100 days. So the implication behind these kinds of books is that you probably don't have very long to make a big impression on your new bit of the organisation, because you won't be there long, because somebody will move you along. You'll have a couple of years at most in that particular position, then you've been moved along. I'm thinking about writing a book called The First 10 Seconds. Shouldn't take me very long to write, or you to read. The real reason I'm here is to sell you my books. There is no other purpose to my life except selling you books. So I currently publish the cheapest and the most expensive books on leadership. The cheapest is £6.50 and the most expensive is £650. The expensive book, which has actually 4 volumes, is much better value than the cheap one. So you should buy the expensive one. You buy my books but don't read them, we both benefit. The second thing that happens is this. A desperate attempt by organisations to restructure themselves all the time. This is what new bosses quite often do. They like to restructure organisations because it looks as though you're doing something. This, I think, is often to be regarded as the seem to be doing something approach to life. So this is the NHS, which many of you will know about, and most of you will probably know it's the 5th largest organisation in the world. And the 2006 structure is very close to the 82 structure. So presumably we went through all of this stuff because we were right in the first place, or somebody thought we ought to be seen to be doing something. Normally, when we restructure organisations, it doesn't damage an organisation because the people that work in the organisation don't actually care what the structure is. They just come in and do the work and go home again. I'm not so sure about the current restructuring in the health service. I'm not quite sure where we're going with that. Or these are pieces of legislation that affect organisations. This happens to be criminal legislation that affects the police in England and Wales. But it wouldn't actually matter which organisation you work for. There is probably somebody in Whitehall, as we sit here, constructing a new piece of legislation to make your life so much easier. We now have so much criminal legislation that crime has been banned. There's no crime left in the country because everything has been banned. Or these are personnel changes. This happens to be the Ministry of Defence, but it wouldn't actually matter which organisation you looked at. At the top of most organisations, there's a significant personnel churn all the time. So the Ministry of Defence, between 1964 and 2009, we had 19 Secretaries of State, we had 20 Chiefs of the overall group, we had 18 Chiefs of the Army, we had a blank screen, thank you. We had, where did we get to? 18 Chiefs of the Army, 18 Chiefs of the Navy, but only 15 Chiefs of the RAF. So 3 members of the RAF have missed out on significant pension rights because the RAF haven't worked out what the game is yet. That's 90 chiefs in 45 years. That's 1 every 6 months on average changes. It takes about 20 years to get an aircraft carrier from somebody's head to the water. It takes a further 5 years to get the aircraft on top of the aircraft carrier, but we won't worry about that. Just think how difficult it is to get these kinds of long-term changes in, given the amount of change you have to cope with on a daily basis. I'm actually surprised anybody ever gets any work done, given the amount of change you have to cope with on a daily basis. This is the government's own restructuring. So between 1980 and 2009, we had 25 new government departments created. Only half of those exist now. Cost somewhere in the region of 780 million to £1 billion. That's an enormous cost, since we don't know what it made a difference or not. There's no value for money assessment, because you can't compare it to anything. So we don't know whether it made any difference. So it's intriguing that the government often requires us to have evidence for our policy, but at the heart of the government, there doesn't seem to be any evidence for its own policy. So we end up doing this, drowning in the waves of change. This is the only rational response I've ever come across. Bohica, bend over, here it comes again. So Bohica is worth thinking about if you find yourself lost on one of these things. So let's pretend it's 1986. And I think it's when zero-based budgeting comes in, and you can't quite get your head around zero-based budgeting. You probably have at most 12 months to put up with this, because the person leading it and the program will have gone within 12 months. There'll be a new program and a new lead. So burying your head in the sand is not necessarily an irrational response. Now, a few years ago, I had a couple of my PhD students looking at change literature independently of each other, and they both came to the same conclusion. Most of it, so most of the stuff that you just looked at, that big long list of things, most of it says something like this top 10 commandments. So I need to change, a viable alternative, change agents in place, sponsorship from above, realistic scale, integrated transition, symbolic end, plan for resistance, constant advocacy, locally owned benefits plan. So the strange thing about this list is that, first of all, it seems to make sense. These are the kinds of things you probably should be doing. Secondly, most of the people that we've looked at say something like this, and yet, despite all that, we don't seem to be able to make change work. So something like 3/4 of all change programs fail in their own terms. So when you ask people, so what were you trying to achieve, and then did you achieve what you were trying to achieve, most people say no, they didn't, they failed. Which is bizarre, since we all know what we should be doing. So how is it that we can't make this stuff work if we all know what we should be doing? This is the reason. About 2 months ago, on my last undergraduate lecture of the year, somebody said, why did you throw the monitor on the floor? It doesn't make any kind of sense. Said, right, let's talk about typewriters. Obviously got to the point where people don't remember typewriters. Anyway, there's a saying which goes with this, and the saying is this: you cannot teach an old dog new tricks. This is the wrong saying. The more appropriate saying is you can't teach an old dog to forget the old tricks, because it's a forgetting problem, it's not a learning problem. So many of the ideas that you've got to change your organisation are really good ideas, but they sit on top of organisational old tricks. They sit on top of organisational politics, they sit on top of people, and that's what screws up your brilliant idea. So think about how we might get round that. Not again. So I'm going to suggest maybe we have different kinds of problems and different kinds of decision styles. So quite often if you get something to work, you then develop a universal model of change in your head and you apply it again next time, and it often doesn't work. And it doesn't work because it isn't the same kind of problem. So I'm going to suggest maybe we have different kinds of problems that are associated with different kinds of decision styles. But before I explain this, let me give you 2 health warnings. The first one is, this is a heuristic, this is a sense-making activity. I'm trying to reduce complexity down to 3. I recognise there are a million different kinds of problems and a million different kinds of decision styles, but my little head can't cope with numbers beyond 3. My whole life is built around 3. So I've got 3 grandchildren and 3 children and one wife. The second health warning is that I might not use these terms in ways that you may be familiar, so my definition of command management and leadership might be different from yours. We need to bear that in mind as I go through this. So I'm going to suggest we have critical problems for commanders. These are decision styles, they're not individuals. 10 problems for managers and wicked problems for leaders. Let's start with the first one, critical problems for commanders. The first thing to think about is they are portrayed as a self-evident crisis. So if people don't think it's a crisis, then you can't command them. That's the connection between the situation as they believe it to be and what you can do with them. Secondly, general uncertainty. The reason we have a crisis is because most people don't know what to do. If they knew what to do, it wouldn't be a crisis. So it's the absence of standard operating procedures generates the crisis. You as the commander have to know what to do. You have to have the answer in your head, otherwise you're a failed commander. And no time for discussion or dissent. So we're not worrying here about health and safety nonsense or management procedures. If you don't do what I'm going to tell you, you're going to lose your life or lose your job. We're in those kinds of situations. Because of the first three, you can coerce people as long as they think there is a crisis. You are the commander with the answer in your head, and you're doing it for the collective good. If they thought you were coercing them for your private gain, they might try and resist you. So I'm associating those four with this decision style of command. And many organisations are run by commanders, not just uniformed organisations, but lots of them are run by commanders. People who are very decisive, people who always seem to know what to do, never panic. They're quite often decisively wrong, but at least they're decisive. You do know you're going in the wrong direction. There's no anxiety about this. You are going in the wrong direction. So some images of commanders here. So there's Russell Crowe, our master and commander, and Mrs. Thatcher, archetypal British political commander. When she was in control, we were always in a crisis. Never quite worked out whether she was causing them or responding to them, but we were always in a crisis. This is Mr. Bush, dressed as an American Air Force officer. This is a giveaway for civilians who like to dress in military uniform. I think in his head he thought of himself as a commander, a very decisive person for whom the world's either black or it's white, it's never grey. This is my eldest daughter, Katie, Thames Valley Police. I'll come back to her in a minute. So three kinds of crisis. We're currently, of course, in a financial crisis. I put those pictures up about 3.5 years ago, thinking they might be with us for about 6 months. I think they might outlive me. The second kind of crisis is this one. This is Edgware Road Station in London, where one of the bombs went off in 2005. When that bomb went off, I was in Paddington Station, the next station along. Bomb goes off here, power failed in Paddington, and somebody in Paddington said, "There's a power failure in this station, please make your way to a different station." So I did. I walked to Edgware Road, it took me about 7 minutes. When I got there, none of these people were here, but there's a similar number of commuters gathered around the entrance. So no one's going in and no one's coming out. There's just smoke coming out. So I'm British, so I joined the back of the queue. I'm about here somewhere, now wondering how I'm going to get to my conference, because the first station doesn't have any power and the second one is on fire. And no one's talking about bombs or terrorism. My phone doesn't work for some reason, so I get my underground paper map out to see which is the next station I need to walk to get to my conference. And as I get my map out and look at it, somebody runs up in this direction towards the back of the group past this car and shouts very loudly at the group, "Get out of the effing way!" Now, when that normally happens on the street, and it happens quite a lot these days, when that normally happens on the street, I look around and see how big the person is who's told me to get out of the effing way before I make a decision about whether I am going to get out of the effing way. And I turned around, and it was actually an ambulance driver. Two big medical bags running at the back of the group, just blocking the entrance. When he gets to the back, which is me, he doesn't put the bags down by me and whisper in my ear, "Excuse me, sir, would you mind moving? There does seem to be a problem here." He shouted very loudly right in my ear, "Get out the way!" And the second time he said it, everybody in the group heard him, turned around, saw what was happening, moved aside, and this man ran down the tube station. So self-evident crisis, general uncertainty, but not in his head, he is the commander with the answer. Nobody else in the group that I'm with has got the faintest idea what to do, including me. No time for discussion or dissent. He's not asking us to move, he's telling us to move, and because it's clearly a crisis, and he's clearly working for the public good, we allow him to coerce us. Not all crises are like these. Sometimes you get a domestic one. Takes me back to Katie. About 5.5 years ago now, I was hosting the extended Grint family Christmas lunch. We had 22 people in my house on this day, and you know at some point today there will be a catastrophe. The question is, how long can you keep normality running for? So we start eating lunch about 1 o'clock, and by 1:25 I have lost the will to live. And the main reason is my mother has been entertaining us again with a 25-minute monologue about her latest knee operation. And I'm looking at my turkey leg thinking, I cannot eat this now. Nor do I know how to get out of the situation. But luckily, I'm sitting by my father, who was in the army for about 150 years. So he will know what to do. He'll have met this scenario many times. So I whispered to him, "Dad, can you shut her up?" He said to me, much too loudly for my liking, "You're the host, you try shutting her up." I don't want to die by this woman's hand at this point in my life, so I don't do anything. I just look at my turkey leg and I begin to pray to it. I'm not even religious, and I'm now reduced to praying to a turkey leg. About a minute later, my prayers are answered by my eldest daughter, Katie, this woman's granddaughter, who said to my mother, "Nanny," and my mother stopped speaking, and she said, "Yes, dear." And Katie said, "Get a grip." Luckily, we laughed at that embarrassing point, but she did stop talking, and we had quite a nice Christmas lunch. Self-evident crisis. General uncertainty, but not Katie's head. She is the commander with the answer, not me. I have no idea what to do. No time for discussion or dissent. Katie doesn't lean over and whisper in my ear, Dad, will it be all right if I abuse your mother? Otherwise, we're never going to get through this lunch. She just did it. And because it's for the public good, it's legitimate coercion. Commander's law. Take the required decisive action, that is to provide the answer to the problem. Now I want to capture that way of thinking about leadership through this creature. White elephant, albino elephant. In Thai culture, if an albino elephant was born, it was treated as a god, omniscient, omnipotent. We treat white elephants as false gods. Look great, cost a fortune, don't do a damn thing. Number 2 also comes from Thai culture, because if a white elephant was born, it was given by the Thai king to his least favoured noble. And so expensive was it to feed, that it would ruin the noble. So if you're a Thai noble and you wake up and there's a white elephant on your lawn, you're finished. I'm going to suggest you do need to be number 1 sometimes, prepared to coerce people for the public good if there's a crisis and you are the commander with the answer in your head. But some of us think we're gods, and then we end up with number 2. Second category of problems. These are Tame problems. These are problems for management as a decision style, as we're defining it. You probably spend 85% of your time addressing Tame problems as a manager. Tame problems is good of a puzzle. There's always a solution to a puzzle, that's why it's called a puzzle. There's always a solution to a Tame problem, if it's a Tame problem. It's going to be complicated, but they're not complex, so you can take them out of their context, fix them, put them back into the context. You haven't changed the context. You can't do that with the complex one that we'll look at in a minute. There will be a unilinear solution to each and every Tame problem. There will be a standard operating procedure for fixing every Tame problem. So Rubik's Cube is a good example of a Tame problem. There is a standard operating procedure for fixing a Rubik's Cube. Does anyone know what it is? It's this. That's how easy it is. Or not, depending on how good you are at reading the instructions. Or even not putting the instructions out. Thank you. You can fix a Rubik's Cube because it's fixable. Even if you don't know what the standard operating procedure is, you'll be able to fix it at some point. If somebody else knows how to fix it, they can tell you how to fix it. It'll be much quicker like that. So these problems that you've solved many times before, and if you haven't, someone next to you will know how to solve them. And if they haven't, there'll be a book which says, this is how you fix this problem. Just follow these procedures and you'll fix it. And if it is a Tame problem, you'll fix it like that. Our heart surgery is a good example of a contemporary medical Tame problem if you're a trained heart surgeon in the contemporary hospital. It's a very complicated procedure, but the procedures work. If I'm doing your heart surgery, you don't have a Tame problem, you have a critical problem, because I have no idea what I'm doing. This tells you the categorization of the problems is subjective, not objective. It depends where you sit and what you know, what kind of a problem you're looking at. Heart surgery to a heart surgeon is Tame, but to anybody else it isn't. Launching another new product, Tame, do what you did last time, it'll be fine. Relocating is a Tame domestic problem. The more you do this, the easier it becomes. If that's what it feels like, it'll be a Tame problem. If it's about efficiency, if there's a tick list involved, it will almost certainly be a Tame problem. So management's role is to engage the appropriate process to solve the Tame problem. I want to capture that way of thinking about decision making with this man, Frederick Taylor, the father of scientific management, published in 1911, 102 years ago. For Taylor, if you applied science properly, you can solve all the world's problems. I think you can solve all the world's Tame problems with the appliance of science, but not all the world's problems are Tame. Problem comes in, goes to the Tame machine, solution comes out the other end. Now this is an example of assuming that education is a Tame problem of efficiency and tick lists. So my wife's a primary school teacher. She teaches reception class, children who are 4 or 5 years old. This is the assessment scheme in her classroom about 7 months ago. Since then, there have been 4 other assessment schemes rolled out. This particular one divided her classroom into 7 cosy corners, and each cosy corner had a tick list of things that she was supposed to catch the children doing. Her job was not to teach them, but to catch them. So, did they do things like this? Experience play and learning in a range of indoor and outdoor environments which stimulate wonder, imagination, excitement, and the disposition to learn. Tick. At the end of the year, she would give all the ticks, put all the ticks in a big book of ticks and give the parents a big book of ticks back, and they'd be thrilled with the number of ticks their children had achieved, which is why she has resigned. Third category of problems. These are wicked problems. These are problems for leadership as a decision style, as we are defining it. Don't have simple solutions, and sometimes they don't have any solutions. They're either novel or recalcitrant. They're novel, they're new to you, and therefore you can't know what to do. Which also implies that there might be somebody in the room who has been here before. To them it might be a Tame problem. All you need to do is swap places and then tell you what to do. But if nobody knows what to do, it might be a wicked problem. Or the recalcitrant problems. You have had this problem many times, but for some reason, you can't fix it. So the current version of terrorism that we face on the mainland is different from the version we had in Northern Ireland, which we have more or less stabilised as opposed to have fixed. So you can tell how people categorise problems by listening to the words they use to describe them. And Mr. Bush used to talk about terrorism in terms of the war on terror that we all win. When we've killed all the terrorists, there won't be any more terrorism. That will be the end of it. We'll have won. If, on the other hand, you think terrorism is more like a kind of conventional criminal act, a policing problem, it might always be with us, in which case it might not be a Tame problem with a solution. Or it's a recalcitrant problem, such as the NHS had this in this country since 1948. So it's not novel, it's increasingly recalcitrant. We have an increasingly ageing population with increasing medical requirements. We have an increasing ability through science to intervene and prolong human life. And we have a decreasing financial base. So we have infinite demand and finite supply. I don't think you can fix the NHS. I don't think it's fixable. It would be fixable if you had an infinite budget. But if you don't, you have a finite budget. You have to say at some point to people, I know what your problem is and I could in theory fix it, but I can't afford the fix. So you're not getting it. Sorry. This is a political decision. It's not a medical decision. I'm not even sure we have an NHS. I think we have an NIS, the National Illness Service. We tend to fix people who are broken. We don't stop them from breaking. We wait till they break and then we try and fix them. So a broken leg is a good example of a Tame medical problem for the National Illness Service. It's 3 or 5 weeks in plaster. It doesn't cost us very much. And it almost always works. But I think that fits within the health service as a whole, which is probably a wicked problem. I'm going to come back to that in a second. So these are complex rather than complicated. You can't solve them in isolation. You try to, what you very often do is generate other kinds of problems. So the global warming is a contemporary wicked problem. And the first generation of biofuels was an attempt to tame that wicked problem. But what that did is take 25% of American agricultural land out of food production, which led to food price increases, food shortages, without fixing global warming. This is typical. When you try and tame wicked problems, you very often generate other problems downstream that you weren't even thinking about when you began the taming process. Often don't have stopping rules and therefore no definition of success. So crime will always be with us. I don't know any society which is large scale or long lived that doesn't have crime. So if your target is zero crime, you are wasting everybody's time. You can make crime better or worse, but you can't actually fix it. It doesn't seem to be fixable. It seems to be part of the human condition. But the trick is to work out how you can manage crime better, rather than how you can pretend to fix it. Sometimes the solution precedes the problem analysis. So I've got 3 grown-up children. When they were growing up in a big problem once, I can remember saying, listen up kids, this is the solution to this problem. And one of them said, that isn't the problem, Dad. But not until you put the solution on the table do you flesh the problem out. So sometimes you have to work with a partial solution because you haven't quite worked out what the problem is. Symptoms of deep divisions. Contradictory certitudes. People are absolutely certain, completely different directions about what to do about every wicked problem. What to do about public sector debt, antisocial behaviour, crime, what to do about Syria, what to do about Libya, what to do about North Korea. People are absolutely certain in completely different directions. I don't have right and wrong solutions, normally just better or worse developments. Worse or worse developments. So if you think Afghanistan is a Tame problem like Iraq was, then you can do what you did in Iraq, which is to flood the place with troops, kill all the bad guys, pull the troops out, you have a stable, free, democratic, liberal society left over. If, on the other hand, it didn't quite work out like that, and if Afghanistan is not the same as Iraq, there might not be a solution to Afghanistan. There might just be better or worse developments. That might be as good as it gets. So uncertainty and ambiguity are inevitable. If we don't like these, we tend to reward people who are good at removing uncertainty, but I'm going to suggest you can't know what to do with a wicked problem. If you do, it isn't a wicked problem. So your job, therefore, is to get used to the uncertainty and learn to live with the ambiguity. This is what Keats the poet calls negative capability. This is the ability not to make a decision. To stand back and to reflect on things. How long have I got before I do need to make a decision? You might have 10 minutes or 10 months or 10 years. You should take this time. Because if you get this decision wrong, we are all screwed forever. Let's stop being so bloody decisive all the time. This is the opposite of positive capability, which is the land of the commander. when you do need to be decisive and you need to do it now. You need to be able to do both. So these problems for leadership, lot management, there's no known process for these kinds of problems. There's no point in you acting like a commander and being decisive because you can't know what to do. If you know what to do, it isn't a wicked problem. Since you don't know the answers, your job is to ask the right kinds of questions. But we tend to reward people who are good with answers, not questions. I can't tell you the number of times I've been into my boss's office and said, "Boss, I've got a problem." And my boss always says, "Keith, you always bring me problems. You've never ever brought me a solution." And I always say, if I had a solution, I wouldn't be in your office, would I? And I have a conversation at the end of which I normally get sacked. But you don't know the answer. Your job is to ask the right kinds of questions and to engage in high levels of collaboration. There might be somebody in the room who knows the answer to the problem, because to them, it might not be a wicked problem, it might be a Tame problem. They might have been here before. Just swap places and then tell you what to do. But if nobody knows what to do, it might be a wicked problem. We need to start a conversation. We need to think about what we are going to do about this problem, recognizing that we might not be able to fix it. It might be as good as it gets, stop it getting any worse. So some very sharp minds have thought about why it is that our knowledge and experience doesn't help us with these kinds of issues. So Hegel, the German philosopher, has the owl of Minerva in some of his work, which only spread its wings at dusk. So the wisest creature we know of doesn't start work until the day is gone. In other words, quite often sense-making is retrospective. So you're at work and you're very, very busy, you're on autopilot making all these decisions, not even thinking about the decisions, you're just making them. And you go home and you take your shoes off and you think, what the hell was all that about? And then retrospectively you make sense of the day. It'll be the same on your deathbed. You'll be lying there thinking, what the hell was all that about? And you will retrospectively make sense of your life, which means that you will die happy. And if you don't, give me a shout, we'll talk this through. Kierkegaard, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Walter Benjamin has the angel of history in some of his work. Facing the past and blown backwards into the future. You've got all this knowledge and all this experience, but where you're about to go, it isn't going to help you very much because you're going somewhere different. And Coleridge, if men could learn from history what lessons it might teach us, but passion and parting blind our eyes, and the light which experience gives us is a lantern on the stern, which shines only on the ways behind us. So I'll give you two examples to clarify the relationship between Tame and wicked problems. These are high jump records across time between 1900 and 1996, and the measures in inches. So between 1920 and 1952, the most popular technique is the Western roll, and you don't seem to be able to get beyond 80 inches using this technique. So, if it's 1953 and you're looking to win the Olympic gold medal in 1956, it doesn't matter how efficiently you train at the Western roll. If you want to win it, stop doing the Western roll. It doesn't matter how good you are at visualizing the gold medal. If you want to win it, stop doing the Western roll. Now, many of us in the public sector, or would be if it was working, many of us in the public sector are wrestling with Western roll problems. So a Western roll problem is about efficiency, about how you get more out of less. But actually there comes a point in time when you can't get more out of less, you have to get different out of less. So the trick is to work out what you are prepared to stop doing to enable you to do what you absolutely need to do. So the efficiency problem is a Western roll problem. It just happens to be the wrong problem. There is no point in being efficient at the wrong problem. What you have to think about is, how do I get a different categorization of the problem? So how do you switch from the Western roll to what would be eventually the Fosbury flop? What makes that work? Second example.
Projectors just rewarding themselves.
Excellent. Just I need to know that. The second example, if I can remember it properly, in 2008 we had 811,000 people in hospital in this country with some kind of alcohol problem. In 2012 we had 1 million people. It cost about £3 billion.
You're right so far.
Historically, we have tended to treat this kind of problem as a Tame problem of efficiency for the National Illness Service. So if I'm the chief executive of an acute hospital, it is in my interest to make sure I get as many drugs as I can on a Friday night and get them through my hospital as efficiently as possible. The more efficiently I get them through my hospital, and the more drugs I get through my hospital, the more rewards I get. I'm not interested in their health. I'm interested in their illness. If I was concerned for their health, my question would not be, how do I get them through my hospital efficiency? My concern would be, how do I stop these people ever getting into this state? This has got nothing to do with hospital efficiency. This is a social problem for us all to wrestle with, which is why we don't, because it's too damn difficult. So what we end up doing, we end up worrying about the Tame problem of efficiency, and it's the wrong problem. Thank you. Now, what we've been doing in the last few years, especially in the public sector, is worrying about the efficiency of the supply side. But there comes a point in time when you can't get more out of less. You have to get different out of less. And the only way to manage this is to think about how we begin to reduce demand. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be efficient at the supply side, but you just can't cope with the problems that are coming up with us. And you can see this best on the famous Barnett graph of doom. So here's the local authority budget line, and you see on this particular example, by 2022, all the money is taken up by adult social care and children's services. There's no money for anything else. I've seen an equivalent for the NHS, which suggests that by 2050, all the money that all of us make will be spent on the NHS. There'll be no money for anything else. You can't do this. This isn't a long-term solution. You can't efficiently get your way out of this problem. It's not about efficiency. It's about how you begin to reduce supply, reduce demand. So a few years ago, we were doing work on the total place experiments. Claire and I, from when we were at Warwick, were working on Claire and I were working on repeated technology. No, we were working on how much it costs to deliver a particular public service in Leicester and Coventry. The one we were working on was how much did it cost us to get a drunk off the streets on a Friday night, take them to a hospital bed or a police cell, sober them up and release them on Saturday morning. How much did that cost, and was there a better way of delivering that service? So we reckon it costs something like £600 per person to do this. And this is what we normally do. On a Saturday 11 o'clock, when we put these people out on the street again, we say to them, thank you very much for your custom, we really enjoyed having you, and we look forward to seeing you next Friday. And what we should be doing is saying, thank you very much for your custom, we really enjoyed having you, and here's the bill. Now, this is not a solution to all problems of alcoholism, because clearly there are some people who have mental health issues and there are some people who are extraordinarily rich, and it wouldn't make a difference to them. But the point about this is a symbolic gesture. It's a way of thinking about how do you deal with wicked problems? And the answer is you have to give them back to the people with the problem, because you can't fix it for them. This is, you may have seen the papers a couple of weeks ago, the drug tax that are used in America, basically doing exactly the same thing that I've just talked about. So Victor Connolly, baby P, when he's killed by his mother and her partner and their lodger, there are two responses by the authorities in quick succession. The first response is a command response, and the command response basically says, find me somebody to hang from a public lamppost. I don't actually care who it is, just find me somebody to get the media off my back. When the hanging has occurred, the next response is a management response, and the management response says, this tragedy occurred for two different reasons. The wrong person was in charge and she's now hanging from a lamppost, and we didn't have a perfect process. So get me a perfect process to make sure this never happens again. And when it happens again, we'll do the same thing. We'll just hang somebody else from a lamppost and we'll put some more process in. Each time it happens, we'll do the same thing, on the assumption that what we're looking at is a Tame problem of efficiency that we can fix with a perfect process. But if it isn't, then you can't fix it like this. So historically, we know that parents have always killed children, they always will. You can make it better or worse, but you can't actually fix it. It doesn't seem to be fixable. But the question to think about is if you treat problems as tame, as if you can fix them with a perfect process, you end up in a particular direction. If you treat them as wicked, you have to stand back and think about, this isn't working, can we try something different? Recognizing that you might not be able to fix it, but we might be able to manage it differently and perhaps better. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Claire who's going to work on blame culture.
Thank you, Keith. Who do we blame for technology? Right, wicked problem in a lot of organisations is the issue of blame, and the reaction of Ed Boyles by hanging Sharon Shoesmith. I'm not getting involved in debate whether or not she deserved it or not, but he had to be seen to blame someone, and that happens a lot in organisations. But what you've got to remember is human error is part of that wicked problem, because no one individual is 100% perfect. I'm sure everyone in this room, and I know I have, and I certainly did during my air traffic career, and I have in other jobs as well, I've made mistakes. We all do it. It cannot be eliminated. But what you can do is you can put efforts and certain things in place to minimise human error, trying to catch human error so you can learn from it and mitigate it. How you do it is you give people personal responsibility, you give them the appropriate skills, and you give them, the most important thing, the right levels of discretion to do it. As I said, aviation is my background, and you'll be pleased to know, those that do fly frequently, that pilots actually do make mistakes. And it has been estimated that they make on average 2 errors per flight segment. But these people have got the right levels of discretion, the right training, and the right levels of ability to catch these and correct them. And sometimes they do it without even knowing that they're doing it, because a lot of the time they describe it as just doing my job. And I'm sure you guys, every day, out there doing your job, correct things, however small they are. It might be something that a colleague's missed or something that you've forgotten to do, but you catch it, because at the end of the day, you're just doing your job, aren't you? That's what we do. But when you're looking at human error, I think it's really, really impossible to look at this classification of what is an honest mistake versus what is an intended mistake. And work by James Reason, and we were taught this in air traffic, so we understood as individuals what and where that line was in the sand, what would be accepted as honest, and obviously what would be investigated, and then what would be punished. So in this diagram here, what I've got in green boxes is the unintended actions. These are the honest mistakes that we all make all the time. So you have a slip of the mind. Sometimes it's an omission of something because you've been very busy, or you may be slightly hungry or fatigued, so you have a slip of the mind. A lapse. These are when you forget things or lose your keys for whatever reason. Again, very similar to the slip. I'll come back to mistake in the amber box in a minute. In the red, you have the intended actions. These are the violations. These are the things that have to be punished. These are acts of sabotage. These are people doing things on purpose. Those are left to the criminal lawyers and HR investigations, whatever. That's a separate issue, but those aren't acceptable. The mistake in the amber box, and in fact I think there should be a dotted line from the unintended across to that. A mistake is something that needs to be learned from an investigator, because people that make mistakes are sometimes doing it because it's a new thing that they've never seen before. It could be a whole new event that you haven't been trained for because it's never happened before. You might not have the knowledge, the tacit knowledge, or it might be someone who's new to a job that hasn't seen it before. This building is a new building. Things are going wrong, we've experienced this morning. They need to be looked at and investigated. It's a snagging thing. But these things happen, but they need to be looked at appropriately. So, a blame culture. The sweep it under the carpet school of management. You've made a mistake, will it show? No, bury it, problems avoided. How many of us have done that? I've made a mistake, will it show? Yes, can I hide it? Yes, or can see it before somebody else finds out. Problem avoided. I know I've done that too. Made a mistake, will it show? Yes, can I hide it? No, can I blame someone else? Yes, if I get in first with my version of events, then the problem's avoided. I've made a mistake, will it show? Yes, no, can I blame someone else? No, could admission damage my career? Yes, sit tight, maybe the problem will go away. Familiar, isn't it? Organisations are very, very good at this. In fact, they're not very good at this, because what happens is all of this goes on. It's what Westrom calls a pathological culture, not just a blame culture. And what happens is people avoid personal responsibility. Failure tends to be punished, as Ed Balls did with Sharon Shoesmith. Things get covered up, they get ignored, they get pushed to one side. And actually what happens is, and the reason why organisations are bad at this, is because organisations end up failing, because they're not learning anything. Things are going unnoticed, and you as individuals aren't learning if things go unnoticed. So you're going to continue to make those mistakes and bury them and hide them and avoid them. A no-blame culture would be the opposite of a blame culture, so you'd think. But actually, a no-blame culture is even worse, because what happens is you made a mistake, will it show? No, I just ignore it. Made a mistake, will it show? Yes, well, I don't need to hide it because it wasn't my fault. Admit it. Hey, it's what we do around here. So actually, the opposite of a blame culture is even worse. You just end up going round and round in circles. It's actually what academic Sidney Dekker calls a drift into failure, which I'll come to in a minute. But BP were the victims of a classic blame culture. Deepwater Horizon, April 2010. We all saw it on the news, and it's still in the news now. Back in 1999, when BP suffered from the Alaska waste dumping fiasco and 2005 with the Texas City refinery blasts, there were huge investigations undertaken by the US government, but also by BP internally, and huge amounts of problems were found. But despite these reports, despite fines imposed on them by the US, they did nothing about these issues. And any employee that did come forward, they were in some cases fired. Most of them were just sanctioned, but they certainly weren't listened to. What employees felt pressured was the fact that what was more important to BP at the time was profit. They wanted to keep making money. In terms of the safety of the people involved, BP didn't appear to care. So what happened was people became nervous, they buried things, they covered things up, they swept it under the carpet, nothing was reported. So there was a shutdown in a flow of safety-related information. As I said, no learning. Disaster struck, Deepwater Horizon disaster happened, 11 people dead, environmental damage far worse than anything that this planet had ever seen before. A corporate image damaged. $57 billion was what BP put to one side to pay compensation. So far, it's gone way above that and is putting the company at risk. Huge risks have been taken over, etc. So, as I said, it's what Sidney Dekker calls the drift into failure. Now, what Sidney argues is that we all live in perfect worlds. Sorry, we don't live in a perfect world, we live in complex worlds. Therefore, what he calls perfect rationality is impossible. And when he's talking about this perfect rationality, he is saying that perfect rationality is when you're capable of knowing absolutely everything. All possible outcomes, all goals, your knowledge is 100%, you know everything. You're the superheroes. But actually, we all know that that is not true. None of us know everything, and we never ever will. So what he argues is human rationality is local, because you only know and can cope with what's going on around you at that moment in time. It's pretty obvious, really, isn't it? You only know what's going on around you. So when you're making decisions in complex situations, it's judgment under circumstances of uncertainty. There's always ambiguity, and how many of you said your problems at the moment are time? Time pressure, time management. Whether it's your time management or somebody else's time management or time, we're all busy people. It tends to be governed by people's local understanding and where your focus is on goals and knowledge. And what Sidney Dekker argues is that complexities can lead to what might work locally, but not what is working globally, because of limited access to information and possible solutions. So as in BP, you're in an organisation where you're not learning, you're at risk of the drift into failure. So how can we look at this? One analogy that I like is the idea of the sharp end and the blunt end. People at the sharp end are the practitioners. They're the people that are directly interacting with the processes, the procedures, the job, the doing the day-to-day thing, the pilot just doing his job. They're the ones that tend to be the protection at that front line of any system. So you are doing what you're meant to do and trying to do the best you can. People at the sharp end are regarded as inheriting an accident rather than actually being the cause. And the reason why I like this is because the people at the blunt end are the people sitting in their offices. They're the regulators, the senior management teams, the people that are coming up with the processes, the government, let's say Ed Balls in the case of Baby Pig. And by putting in these extra processes, what they're sometimes doing is actually not realising what real life is like at the sharp end. Some people may have started their careers at the sharp end and have worked their way up that knife edge to be now sitting at the blunt end, but what they don't realise is how much things have changed working at the sharp end. So there's a big difference there. So the blunt end fail to appreciate information that's given to them if the sharp end aren't talking to them or they haven't been there for a while. So therefore, potential risks, and it's that drift into failure Sidney Dekker was talking about. A really good example of this, a horrible example of this, sorry to be depressing, but is the unfortunate death of a lady called Alison Hume and the failed attempt to rescue her. She one day went out for a walk with her dog, as she did every day. She was usually home within the hour, but that day, after about 4 hours, her daughter was concerned, so went out looking for her mother, knew the route she walked, similar to me walking my dog. I do a similar route every day. And her daughter had found that her mother had fallen down a 40-foot disused mine shaft. Her mum was conscious. She heard her mum shouting for help. Her daughter raised the alarms. The emergency services turned up, paramedics, police and the fire service. And above the ground, the fire officers argued for 6 hours about how they were going to get her out. The reason for the argument that rules and regulations set by those at the blunt end had written rules and regulations saying that no one without the appropriate training and no one that was not a fire officer, i.e. no member of the public or another emergency service, i.e. a paramedic, could use the hoist equipment that they'd got to go down and rescue her. They did manage to get a fire officer down with some oxygen to Alison to try and help her and reassure and comfort her. But because the rules said that no member of the public could use this lift mechanism, they couldn't get her out. But also, she hadn't had the training, so they were following the rules to the book. Alan Jeffreys, who was quoted in the news at the time, is the team leader of the Scottish Cave and Rescue Organisation. They were 40 minutes away. They're a voluntary organisation. Therefore, they're not subject to the same rules and regulations that the fire officers were. And Alan Jeffreys at the time was quoted as saying, "But in a situation where there is human life involved, I think some large injection of common sense is called for. I would employ the Latin expression, seize the moment and deal with the matter, and sort out the breaking of rules and regulations later." The other side of the blame culture coin is Prozac leadership. A colleague of Keith's at Lancaster University, David Collinson, coined this phrase, and he argues that Prozac leaders and Prozac leadership encourages leaders to believe their own propaganda. Prozac leadership discourages people from raising problems, admitting mistakes and focusing on failure. And the only people that believe the corporate messages are the corporate leaders themselves. But corporate leaders tend to be constantly surprised when things goes wrong, given how well everything seems to be going. So an example of this, going back to BP, is when Tony Hayward heard about the Deepwater Horizon disaster and he walked into his boardroom, his board of directors, people he trusted, people he thought he could talk to. One of the first things he was quoted as saying was, "What have we done to deserve this? Why has this happened to us?" Well, no one was telling him anything because he thought everything was going on okay, but there was no structure, there was no flow of information going to him. No one was telling him the reality of what was going on the ground. So to come back to the analogy of the knife and to think about this Prozac leadership and blame culture, I just want to sort of talk about accountability and responsibility a little bit, and actually the difference between the two words. I found in conversation when I started air traffic that these words were used quite all the time in the same sentence. You know, accountability, responsibility, well, I'm accountable for that, responsible for that, and blah, blah, blah. And I don't think people really understand the difference between the two. And I believe that accountability is those at the blunt end. They're the people that are answerable, they're the ones that do the training, they select the people, they make sure the appropriate equipment's in place, the appropriate training's in place, they provide support, they provide leadership. The people who are responsible, basically everyone should be responsible and take personal responsibility. As Keith said, with wicked problems, you need to take personal responsibility. You have got a duty to act on your own, to do the job, safely observe anything that's going on and report observations in unusual situations. Make them known to the people at the blunt end. But then the people at the blunt end should also have an open relationship with you at the sharp end, so you feel that you can approach them and talk about mistakes, errors, things that are going wrong, unusual situations. And Sidney Dekker argues that unjust responses to failure are almost never the result of a bad performance. They are the result of a bad relationship. So the important thing between the blunt end and the sharp end, and it's a dual responsibility between the two. Accountable people should be talking to those responsible, and those responsible should be talking to those accountable. Swiss cheese model by James Reason. This is very, very common actually. It's used quite a lot across industry now, and certainly in aviation. And it goes back to what Keith was saying about Baby P and Ed Balls just putting in more layers of process. What we tend to do in organisations is we keep layering up more and more process. So when things go wrong, we put in another layer of process, and that's what the Swiss cheese slices are. It's just another layer of process. So you put process in, something goes wrong, slips through the hole, but don't worry, we'll just put some more process in to catch it. Oh, but don't worry, because if that goes wrong, we'll just put another layer of process in to catch it, and so on. But the fact is, there is no such thing as a perfect process. As I've said, there's no such thing as a perfect human being. So what happens is eventually, as it did with Baby P, the holes line up, and bang, you have an incident. Similar to BP, eventually, all the holes will line up. You'll have an accident. So what needs to be done is people at the sharp end, the people here, they need to be able to interact with things. They're the stopping mechanisms. They're the people that should have personal discretion and take personal responsibility to act and stop the accidents happening. Rather than being blamed for it and living in a fear culture, people should be given the opportunities to open up and report these things. And this is what Sidney Decker calls, and what we called in aviation and started coining the phrase back in the early 90s, is the idea of a just culture. Now, a just culture, or as Western called it, the generative culture, is one of those things that Keith was saying. It's not necessarily a solution to blame or fear cultures, but what it can do is it can make it easier. A just culture is when you've made a mistake, yes. Will it show, made a mistake, yes. Do I need to hide it? Well, I don't need to hide it because it could be partly my fault, but it's likely that other factors are involved and I have a responsibility to prevent it from happening again. So I feel comfortable to admit it, I'm able to report it, it'll get investigated, organisational learning occurs, therefore personal responsibility has been taken, the organisation will improve and everyone knows why. Now, the reason why this is not a total solution to the wicked problem of blame and human error is because this is a utopia. This is never going to be 100% perfect. Because as I said, no system is perfect, no human is perfect. But what it has done in the aviation industry, and also nuclear and others, is it has reduced accidents, it has made it safer, and it has made people feel a lot more comfortable, open and honest, have better relationships with the managers, and I would say in about 70% of the time, this is now working in aviation. It's never going to be perfect, but then again, wicked problems can't be solved that easily. Keith?
Thanks. So there's something in all of that about the issue of personal responsibility I want you to worry about. So you may remember 3.5 years ago when the snow came and the country ground to a halt. I live in deepest Oxfordshire at the bottom of a valley. And the snow was forecast for 3 days, but when I got into my car, there hadn't been any snow. But as I turned my engine on, a huge snowflake settled on my windscreen, right in my line of vision, and I thought to myself, what would health and safety say to me now? And I thought I heard them say, don't go to work, it's way too dangerous with a single snowflake right in front of you. So I didn't go to work, I had 3 days off, it was great, got loads of work done. But day 4 of this, it becomes apparent after an audit of the house, there's no more than 6 months' food left in the entire house. And starvation haunts the corridors of power. There are children wailing about the approach of death and the absence of customers and cornflakes and God knows what. I am sent by the powers that be in my house to go looking for food. I don't even know what I'm looking for, but as I drive out of my drive, my wife says, if you find a buffalo, tether it to the car and drag it back. Thanks, dear, I'll look for a buffalo. I go to Woodstock, which is my nearest town. It looks a bit like this. It's full of snow. There's no buffaloes about. And I can't even see these shops that are open. Well, I'm walking down, and eventually I come across 2 shopkeepers who are in their doorways complaining about the absence of customers, which is explained by the absence of the Oxfordshire snowplough team. Now, as I drive in, I put the local radio on. The local radio says the Oxford snowplough team is stuck in snow in Oxford and won't be coming out to play. So you are on your own. So I relate the information to these 2 people, and they both said, it's not our problem, mate. And I said, I don't think you heard what I just told you. It is your problem because they're not coming to save you. And they both said, listen, mate, we pay the rates. It's not our job to clear the snow. It's the local authority job to clear the snow. When they clear the snow, then we'll get some customers in. And I said, I don't think you heard what I just told you, mate. Why don't you get your snow shovels out and shovel your own snow away, then maybe you get some customers in. And then told where to put both snow shovels simultaneously. So I had some more helpful advice. I said, listen mate, I used to live in Germany for a long time, and in Germany it's a legal requirement to clear the snow from your drive. And the conversation turns distinctly colder. The first shopkeeper said, how come the Germans can get through the snow and the Brits can't? And the second one said, how come your English is so good for a German? The first one said, do you know about 1965 and who won the World Cup and against who? I said, technically you're on both counts because it was 1966 and it should be against whom, not whom, because it's a subject, not an object. And the second one said, since we're on the bloody war, I left at that point and thought to myself, on reflection, this is quite a nice example of a wicked problem. You cannot solve people's wicked problems. You have to give them back to the people with the problem. It doesn't make you popular, but your job isn't to be popular. Your job is to get the collective to address its own wicked problems. This isn't a German thing. This was Edward I, who was King of England in 1285 when he issues the Statute of Winchester. This is a legal response to an upsurge in robberies on the King's Highway, as it's called. What's happening is hedges and woods are growing closer and closer to the main roads, and robbers are hiding in the hedges and woods and robbing people. From this point onwards, if a robbery occurs because the robbers have been hiding in your hedge or your wood, you are responsible for the robbery. So now you have an incentive to do something about the hedge or the wood. This is also the origins of the so-called hue and cry legislation. From this point onwards, if a crime occurs in your village, you have a legal responsibility to chase down the villain and hold him until the sheriff turns up. And if you don't, you are responsible for the crime. So hitherto, crime has been somebody else's problem, and now it's your problem. A sign in Copenhagen, same time of the year when the snow was everywhere. I went to a conference, and as I came back from my conference, I thought I took a shortcut to a snow-strewn park to get to my hotel. But when I got to the entrance of the park, the sign at the front of the park in Danish appeared to say, the path in this part of the garden would not be cleared of snow and ice. So we don't have these kinds of signs in our country, so we allow people to walk over snow-strewn parks, fall over, break their legs, and then sue us for not clearing the snow. The Danish actually says, don't be an arse. Take some personal responsibility, muppet. I'm translating loosely. We need more don't be an arse signs. In 2003, the fire brigade union went on strike, and it coincided with a reduction in fires. Now, I'm assuming fire officers don't normally set fires to houses to practice putting them out. I'm assuming this is what's happening. It's a Friday night, so some of you in the local pub are having your normal 10 pints of lager. You then stagger home, put the chip pan on, get into your cosy chair, fall asleep, wake up, your house is on fire, call the fire brigade to come put your house out. But from this point onwards, there's no fire brigade, so you change your pattern of behaviour. The same people are in the pub. But since there's no fire brigade, you only have 9 pints of lager, and you buy the chips from the chip shop, because you know there is no one coming to save you. So there's something locked into here about the number of safety nets people need. If you give them too many safety nets, they avoid personal responsibility. If you don't give them enough, there's a catastrophe coming their way. You have to get the number right. So I want to capture that way of thinking about leadership through a couple of examples. This is the first one. This is Michael Abrashoff, who was the captain of this American destroyer between 97 and 99. When he picks up the ship in 97, it's the worst performing ship in the Pacific Fleet on every criteria they measure. So gunnery accuracy, readiness for combat, retention rate, promotion rate, sickness rate, you name it, it's the worst. He doesn't have a reputation for knowing how to turn alien ships around. It's just his turn. He has no idea what to do with any of the problems on the ship. So for him, it's one big wicked problem, even though the book doesn't use that terminology. But he has a process to address the problems, and that is to ask the crew to help him. And the book is about how the crew turn the ship around. Not how he does, but how the crew do. I'll give you 2 examples. So the ship is painted every 2 months because it rusts so badly. And he asks the painters, how can you improve the painting? And they say, why don't we get some stainless steel nuts and bolts? It's not a rocket science. So he rings up the admiral and says, look, can you send me some stainless steel nuts and bolts for my destroyer, please? And they say, no, we don't stock them. There's no demand for them. So he goes to Home Depot, the store in San Diego Harbor, with a ship's credit card and buys them and puts them on the ship, and then the painting lasts for 12 months. And instantly there's a queue of other ship's captains with their own ship's credit cards doing the same thing from the same store. Second example, the crew have to wear something called standard issue foul weather jackets. These are big uncomfortable jackets. They cost $150 each, and they're very uncomfortable, and there's no flotation device built into them, so if you go to the side of one of these jackets, you're going to drown quite quickly. Their crew hate them. They're complaining to him one day about the jackets, and he says, stop complaining and see if you can find a designer on board that can design something cheaper and better. And if you can, you get that made up and you can wear that instead. That's what they do. So the new design costs $90, not $150, as the name of the ship across the back, built-in flotation device, very comfortable. Crew love wearing their new jackets, but the first time they come back into San Diego wearing their new jackets, he gets a phone call from the senior officer in the harbour saying, you're meant to have been spied wearing non-standard issue foul weather jackets. And he says, yeah, they're great, aren't they, sir? And the senior officer says, no, they're not great, they're illegal. You will get them out of their illegal jackets and back into their legal jackets before you dock. And Abrashoff refuses. And at the end of a very long conversation, Abrashoff says, I'm now going to refuse a legitimate order. So you can court-martial me. You can do this on 2 grounds. 1, I've just saved you half the clothing budget on this year. And 2, I've just improved morale by 100%. And on that basis, I'm actually happy for you to court-martial me. And the senior officer says, I'll think about that. Doesn't court-martial him. And then this ship wins the Spokane Trophy for the best prepared ship in the US Pacific Fleet. It's gone from the worst to the best in 2 years, with him not knowing a single answer to any of the problems on the ship. But he has a process. Ask the crew. So I want to capture that way of thinking about leadership through regarding it as a wheelwright. This comes from a story about the Chinese Empire Liao Bang. 3rd century BC, consolidated China and held a banquet to celebrate the consolidation. To the banquet came lots of people, but one of them couldn't understand why he was the emperor, because he wasn't a noble, and nor did he appear to be an expert in anything. So he asked the military expert, Chen Sen, so why is this man the emperor? And Chen said, well, what determines the strength of the wheel? And the guest said, the strength of the spokes. And Chen responded, 2 sets of spokes of identical strength do not necessarily make wheels of identical strength. The strength is also affected by the spaces between the spokes. And determining the spaces is the true art of the wheelwright. In other words, you don't need to be an expert to be successful facing wicked problems. You just have to surround yourself with people who are experts and then give them some space to work. So let me just summarise where we've got to, if I can get the picture back up, thank you. In terms of these 3 decision styles, command, management, leadership, and these 3 criteria. Again, this is a heuristic sense-making activity. I'm suggesting command's about tactical space, management operational space, and leadership strategic space. Time you've got for a decision. Command's normally short-term, management medium-term, and leadership long-term. And the kind of problem you're looking at. Command's for critical problems, management's for tame problems, and leadership's for wicked problems. So command is just do it. I don't actually care what you think about this, do it. Management, deja vu, you've been here before many times, you know which process will solve it, just roll it out. Leadership, vu jardin, you've never been here before, and if you have, you've never been able to fix it. You get a collective view on what to do about this. And so this man, Etzioni, in his work on compliance, argued there are probably 3 reasons why people want to follow you, which fits quite nicely with this typology. He talked about coercive institutions and coercive compliance. He was working in a prison and argued if you work in a prison, you could normally force people there to follow you. I'm suggesting you can force people to follow you if they think there's a crisis. You are the commander with the answer in your head and you're doing it for the collective good. But most of us live in the blue zone, what he called calculative compliance. People will follow you here, not because you're forcing them, but because it's their job to follow you. It's therefore rational for them to comply. Fits with tame problems and the role of management as we've defined it. Just occasionally talked about normative compliance. People will follow you here, not because you're forcing them, not because it's their job to follow you, but because they want to. This is the most difficult one to do, which is why it's restricted to wicked problems and the role of leadership as we are defining it. So we end up with this. So you're the decision maker inside here, and the further you've got the vertical axis, the more uncertainty you have about trying to work out what you should be doing. The further you go along the horizontal axis, the more collaboration you require. So when you're facing a critical problem, act as a commander, provide the answer. You get access to coercion or physical power. That's what Joseph Nye calls hard power, if you know Joe's role. Most of us live in the blue box most of the time, facing a tame problem. Act as a manager, organise a process. You get access to calculative or rational compliance. Just occasionally you get a wicked problem for which you can't know what to do. Your job therefore is to act as a leader as we've defined it, ask appropriate questions, and engage in high levels of normative or emotional collaboration, what Joe calls soft power. All right, that is an hour and a bit's brain dump. Let me pause for breath and see if you have any questions. Because after lunch, it gets worse. So we need to be on the same page at this point. Any points you'd like to raise or questions? Yeah.
It's just, I know you say sort of getting people to sort of get the way they, or forget what they've done in the past, but sometimes something maybe is the expectations that are put on you.
Yeah.
And to kind of not diffuse that to actually, well, I'll come back to you on that, and it's the answer now. Kind
Yes.
of trying to deal with that kind of interpersonal stuff.
Yeah, so quite often there are all kinds of things in what you just said. Part of the problem is that some people like to push you down to the red zone to give you an answer instantly. And what you have to be able to do is to be able to distance and displace this desire on their part for you to fix their problem. There are several ways of thinking about this. One is what Ronnie Heifetz calls, is one of his definitions of leadership. It's about disappointing people at a rate they can manage. So I know you're looking for me to fix your problem, but trust me, I can't fix it. I will help you fix it, but I can't fix it. So you have to be able to disappoint people who are looking for you to fix their problem. Because of course, if you do fix it, they'll bring you another one tomorrow. And this is the equivalent of teaching someone to ride a bike. If you don't let go of them, they will never learn to ride a bike. And you know they're going to fall over and scrape their knees, but that's the way you learn to do it. So you have to disappoint people at a rate they can manage. That's part of the issue. Second thing is about the kinds of techniques that you could use to displace this. So quite often my boss rings me up and says, Keith, I need an answer on this now. And I usually say, hang on a second, I've got somebody in the room. I'll ring you back in 5 minutes. I'll put the phone down and I'll think for 5 minutes, how am I going to answer this question? Because I just need 5 minutes. Because I know what I'm like, I'll just say something and I'll regret this for the rest of my life. So I'll say nothing at this point because you've already wound me up by ringing me up. I'll put the phone down and I'll think about it. And then I'll ring him back 15 minutes later. And I'll have organised this and I'll have written down what I'm going to say. So it's about how you manage that kind of interaction. The other thing to think about, some people, this has the kind of the individual and institutional preferences built into it. So there are some people who like to think everything is a critical problem, because that allows them to be a commander and shout at people. So my father's in the army for 1 million years. When he came out, he had one civilian job, that was director of Gloucestershire Red Cross. And at the end of the first week, I rang him up and said, how are you doing, Dad? He said, oh, you better come and see me. I said, why? He said, well, on Monday I had 10 people working for me and I've got 1 left. And I said, what do you think the problem is? And he said, they just won't obey my orders. He said, Dad, they're volunteers. Well, they should still obey my orders. I said, I'll come and talk to you about that. So for him, everything is a crisis because he likes to shout at people. That's just the way he is. Once you've recognised this, you know how to handle it, but until that point, you just don't. Some people like to think that everything is a Tame problem. There must be a process that will fix every problem. And in fact, there might not be. And some people like to think everything is wicked and we shouldn't make any kind of decisions, because it's way too dangerous to make a decision. So they will say everything is wicked. So there are individual preferences built in. There are also institutional preferences built in. So if you're in a uniformed organisation and you're looking for promotion, you have to be good in the red zone. You have to be good at command in a uniformed organisation, otherwise you're never going to get anywhere. So if we're in the, think about the military, for example, the army, if a war breaks out, you know they're pretty good at the command bit. They're not bad at the blue bit, they're not bad at the organising. We'll get the right boots to the troops 6 months after the war started in Iraq. We get the right vehicles to the troops in Afghanistan just as we're leaving Afghanistan. We get the right vehicles going out. That'll take us about 10 years to sort that out. But once we've asked Tesco's how they do it, we'll sort it out and we'll fix it. Not very good at the green zone. Not very good at asking difficult questions like, what's the purpose of a nuclear deterrent? Who are you trying to deter? What's the purpose of having 2 aircraft carriers with no aircraft on? Whose big idea was that? Why do you keep changing the aircraft on the aircraft carriers? Whose big idea was that? So not very good at difficult questions, but good in this zone. Whereas Claire and I are academics, so we live in the green zone. Nothing must ever be decided under any circumstance about anything ever. It's way more complex than you ever thought possible. And I need more research funding to be able to answer your question. And when I've done the research, even I will be confused by the complexity of the issues that I've just looked at. So I now need more research funding to be able to answer my own questions. So if you're all academics in this room and a fire breaks out in this building, you know we are going to die today. There'll be some rich conversations about what counts as a fire. Isn't it intriguing how people respond differently? No, not really. Since you're not all academics and some of you are therefore normal, if a fire breaks out, I shall be telling you, get the hell out of the building and follow me. But this afternoon when we're talking about, so what should be the strategy for your organisation? I have absolutely no idea. I'm not an expert in your organisation, you lot are, so I'm going to be asking you to help me construct a strategy. And somebody in the room was saying, hang on a second, Keith, this morning you were telling us what to do, and now you're asking for our help. You're completely inconsistent. And I'm going to say, absolutely. I think you should be inconsistent between different categories of problems. But if you don't have the language to be able to do this, then you can't do it. So partly this is a language game. What you can't do with people and say, do you know what? I have no idea what to do. Because that's failure. But you can say this, I think what we're looking at is a wicked problem. We all know what wicked problems are. Is there anybody in the room who thinks this is not a wicked problem? In which there is, come up here, swap places and tell us what you think we should be doing. And if nobody moves, I'm now going to assume we all agree it's a wicked problem. We need to start a conversation about this. So what this does is be able to legitimate a way of saying, I'm not sure what the answer is. And you can't do that unless you have a common understanding of the language, a common framework. So if you go back to work and tomorrow somebody comes up to you and says, boss, I've got a problem, and you say, this could be a wicked problem for which there might be a clumsy solution, they're going to say, you've been on a bloody course or something. Shall I come back tomorrow when you've forgotten all that nonsense? Because what we're doing in this room at the moment is taking individual leaders out, sheep-dip them in the language and send them home and then worry why it doesn't work, because they have no idea what you're talking about. So what you should be doing is taking teams out and sheep-dipping them in a similar kind of language frame so you can have a common understanding of the way the world works. It doesn't actually matter which language you use, it just has to be the same language. That's a very long answer to a very short question.
I've got one question, it may be two, depending on your answer. If you've got, presumably there are some problems that have got a crossover between Tame and Wicked, and you're not entirely sure whether it's a Tame or a Wicked problem. Is there a way of actually, and that's presumably quite critical in the way you go about sorting it out as well, how can you tell the difference between a Tame problem that you're simply rubbish at sorting out and it's actually a Wicked problem?
Yeah. So the first thing to think about is that problems don't come looking like this. They come in a bit of a mess with bits hanging out, and you're not sure which bit is which. So it's always a complex issue to think about, and it may be that problems come with 2 or even 3 aspects of it. Second thing is, these are often contested. So you will say, this is a wicked problem, and say, no, it's not, it's a Tame problem. So it's a contestation here, so you have to be able to persuade people into your way of thinking about it for them to be able to assess it. The third thing is about, what kind of a problem would it be? For me, this is quite a pragmatic issue. If you think it's a Tame problem, and you're organising the process, and it isn't working, it probably isn't a Tame problem. It might be one of these two. So it's about, if what you're doing is currently working fine, forget all this nonsense and just get on with your life. Because what you're looking at is Tame problems. If on the other hand it doesn't working, then maybe you should step back and reflect and refract a different kind of understanding of the problem. If it was a different kind of problem, would we do something different? So it's a kind of pragmatic issue. I don't think there's a scientific issue here. It's not as if, because of this contestation aspect, it's not as if we did more analysis and had better numbers, we would know what kind of a problem it is. But these are always political issues, because quite often what happens is the people in here will try and define issues in certain kinds of ways to enable them to do what they like doing. So if you want to invade somebody, you can't say, oh, we think the place we're about to invade is a Tame problem, because if it's a Tame problem, you shouldn't be invading them. So you have to be able to persuade them. Now we're going to invade them because they've got weapons of mass destruction, and there's a 45-minute problem, and we don't have time for this nonsense. We're going to have to invade them. And when you invade them, when you persuade enough people, not everybody, when you persuade enough people that you're right, and you invade them, and there aren't weapons of mass destruction, it doesn't matter because it's too late anyway. So there's as much to do with the constitution of the problem by decision makers as an analysis of the problem. This implies a kind of objectivity to the world that I don't think exists. This implies decision makers will try to persuade us that what we're looking at are particular kinds of problems. So when the Chancellor says, we've got another 5 years of austerity, says who? Why do I believe you? Where's the data? What makes you think you're right? And there will always be contestation about this.